colleague, DIKELEDI, MAGADZI, and all other officials who are with us today. Firstly, I would really like to express my appreciation to the Deputy Minister of the Department of Transport for inviting me to participate in her department's webinar on 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children. Colleagues, as you know, the campaign targets South Africans at national, provincial, and district levels with the following objectives: to strengthen the implementation of the National Strategic Plan by all social partners, to expand on the call to action for men as partners and boys to stand against rape and sexual abuse of women and children. Lastly, to increase awareness and drive change in relation to negative social norms and behavior. This will be done through multiple platforms, sectors, and activism. As the program director has indicated, let me just repeat the start of the campaign, that this is a UN campaign. South Africa was amongst the first countries to raise the hand that we are in, will do it annually. But the 2020 16 days of activism commenced at the Union Building in the early hours of the morning of the 25th. Ministers and deputy ministers were invited to go to the Union Building early hours for the raising of the flag at half-mast and also the lighting of the torch for peace. And this was done really in a dignified manner with the guidance of the army under the leadership of Deputy President Mabuza. It was important to do it since we had too many lives which were lost during COVID-19, and also we've had horror cases of women being raped, some found hanging pregnant, some disappearing in universities, children being buried in shallow graves. All the things we've seen during these past few months, they talk to a nation that needed healing. So it was then said, for the next 5 days, we should go through a period of mourning or prayers, whatever one can use, so as to remember the lives that were lost in the hands of men. As we share their grief, we called on all our churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, and houses of prayer to hold prayer sessions to support families or surviving families, so as to cope with the loss of the loved one. On the same day, in the afternoon, the President, His Excellency President Ramaphosa, held a national dialogue on the state of gender-based violence in our country. Again, I'm not going to go into details about what the nation had. I will continue to say this year's 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children is being held under the theme Women's Economic Justice for a Non-Violent and Non-Sexist South Africa. And we know our sister department will take from the theme but make it appropriate to their departments, as we are hoping to hear from the Deputy Minister of Transport. The campaign's theme, it really aims to focus the nation on the importance of women's economic empowerment as an integral component of efforts to eradicate gender-based violence and femicides and build a non-sexist South Africa. Our response to gender-based violence is informed by our decisiveness to implement the 6 key pillars of the National Strategic Plan. Before I mention the pillars, I would say to the Deputy Minister, we had a steering committee which worked under the presidency, and then they produced, it was government and civil society, and then they produced this National Strategic Plan. That's the one which we use as a framework whenever we're talking about gender-based violence. It has got 6 pillars. I understand there's an official from the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability. I'm sure she will have time to elaborate upon these 6 key pillars. But just briefly, pillar 1 talks to accountability, leadership, and coordination. Pillar 2, prevention and restoration of social fabric. Pillar 3, protection, safety, and justice. Pillar 4, response to care, support, and healing. Pillar 5, economic empowerment. Of course, the last pillar, it looks at our information systems and the kind of research that we need to do at a local level so as to have a deeper understanding of this problem in each and every community. As part of institutionalizing the implementation of the National Strategic Plan, a number of processes have been employed by the department to enforce accountability, provide leadership, and coordinate implementations. And one of the things we have worked hard on was to say, for this policy framework to be implemented, it has to be implemented within the district development model, because all ministers and deputy ministers have been deployed to districts to champion big projects there. So the question of gender-based violence can no longer just be a side issue. It has to be at the center where all spheres of government are implementing. But also as a department, we also have persons with disabilities, different kinds of disabilities who have been brought from social development to us. They are also critical in a debate where we're talking about gender-based violence. We know that within the criminal justice system, they face even a double challenge compared to women in general. And I'm really glad that the Ministry of Transport is leading. I heard that the minister also mentioned the issue at the close of the Transport Month, but also in our discussions with the Deputy Minister, she seems to have a clear vision of how she can coordinate and provide leadership within a sector. So we really appreciate that a lot. From the distance, we see the transport sector as an important stakeholder when we are considering the safety of women, youth, and persons with disabilities using public transport such as taxis, buses, trains as a mode of transport on a daily basis. We know of many cases that have taken place within this sector. Therefore, it's important to just talk a little bit about Pillar 2 and Pillar 5. I have mentioned Pillar 2 as something that, as a pillar that talks to prevention. So in our structures, we have to target key reinforcers of this problem. I know, for instance, our department have made an effort to train the taxi operators just to help them understand gender-based violence and femicide. It cannot be enough. We cannot work on this assignment away from the authorities, that is the Minister and the Deputy Minister of Transport. Even in the webinars we've had, we have mentioned to them that we have the support of the leadership of this department. So we appreciate it then if the Department of Transport recognizes the importance of the National Strategic Plan and also the importance of implementing the relevant pillars. Besides prevention, which is Pillar 2, I said Pillar 5 is important. I don't think there's any economic hub in government that could help us to have a clear program over the next 365 days, which will ensure women and economic justice. I don't think there's a better one than the Department of Transport. So we are hoping that there'll be more commitments from the department. The theme also refers to women's role in the world of work, access to opportunities across all sectors, being treated fairly with respect and counted as equal citizens, even at male-dominated sectors. This should in turn provide further impetus to strategic interventions which will ensure the radical transformation of gender relations and the political, social, and economic empowerment of women, including young women and those with disabilities. Several actions have been taken towards building women's economic power. South Africa is in the process of ratifying International Labour Organization C190, which is a United Nations agency, which establishes a global standard for the protection of women in the world of work. The goal of the ILO is to advance social and economic justice by setting international labor standards, and its aim is to ensure safe workplaces that are free of violence against women. This work also aims to galvanize national leadership for gender equality and addressing gender-based violence and femicide in the workplace. As I conclude, let us all join hands to play our part in implementing the National Strategic Plan. We know the struggle to end gender-based violence and femicide is a long one. We have a vision as a country to build a South Africa in which all women, LGBTQIA+ persons, and children across age, across location, across race, and across sexual orientation are safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Mkhize. I will allow my colleague, Rufen Shinas, to take over the program. As we welcome the Deputy Minister of Transport, DIKELEDI MAGADZI, to give us the keynote address. Thank you very much.
Unmute, Refense. Unmute.
Oh, thank you, Deputy Minister. Good afternoon, Deputy Minister Magadzi, Deputy Minister Mkhize. My sincerest apologies for the technical glitch that was experienced, but I am here now and I'm excited to be here. Thank you. Thanks to Deputy Minister Mkhize for that address. Now I would like to invite the Deputy Minister of the Department of Transport, who is our host here this afternoon, to come in and give us the opening address for this webinar. Over to you, Deputy Minister Magadzi.
Thank you very much, Program Director Refense Shinas. My colleague, Deputy Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability, Professor Thengwe Mkhize, distinguished ladies and gentlemen who are on the webinar, and in particular, those that will be sharing the roundtable and giving us insight into the critical issues that we are discussing. I also would like to say to the panelists and the viewers that this is one of the most important subjects that as women, when we interact and engage, we must remember that one life lost is one life too many, and always strive to prevent and protect those that are vulnerable. Program Director, resolving the matter at hand in this roundtable and the discussions that we will be having must depend on a strong partnership across all of us in the society, given the serious nature of the issues that have brought us together this afternoon. The issues relate most significantly to human rights, and the exercise that we are engaged in is the exercise that we must make sure that we protect human rights and human life and share the use of public facilities and public services in such a manner that we respect and uphold human rights. This we wish to tackle from a point of view of the rights of persons with disability, the rights of women and girls, the rights of the elderly, and the persons that we are targeting are the people who actually, many a times, violence is meted onto them, particularly in the space of the public transport. We must be open, we must be frank, and we must be constructive enough for us to find a collective way forward out of the inequalities affecting the persons and the groups that I have already spoken to, as we look at gender-based violence and femicide that is meted against them. We will, in this roundtable, interact in a complex discussion that must bring together the needed and the most important issues that can be able to deal with the intricate mix of situation in the public transport sector, particularly focusing on the vulnerable group. It must, however, be noted that these vulnerable groups of persons consist more, not just women, not just girls or persons with disability, but must also think of the pregnant woman, who must think of the elderly woman, who must also think of the infirmed and the LGBTQI community, who are always and every time discriminated against. Usually, the issues that are being spoken to ranges from a variety of issues. Some of the issues affecting these groups in question relate to, amongst others, particularly in our transport sphere, the ablution facilities, it be in train stations or bus stations or taxi ranks, which actually sometimes are not even working, or the list, you will find that there's a taxi rank, it doesn't even have ablution facilities. In some cases, this includes inappropriate designs of public roads and inappropriate designs of public transport. Let us look at the taxis. If you are a disabled person with a wheelchair, most of the time you end up being left behind because the taxis, the way they are manufactured, cannot be able to accommodate or give space to a wheelchair in that situation. The same applies to our buses and our trains. And these are the things that, as we are talking, as my colleague, Deputy Minister Professor Mkhize, has spoken to economic issues, we need to start saying, how do we engage the manufacturers of the public transport in such a way that they will be able to remember that it is not all of us who are gifted and are not disabled, but as they manufacture, they must also take into consideration issues of disability. Most taxi drivers will not even dare to assist people with disabilities, but would rather leave that person, if they are in their taxis, to the passengers instead. Think of a person who is partially sighted or totally blind, who enters a taxi and say, I'm going to be alighting off at this particular area, and it will be upon the good Samaritan, as in a passenger, who will be able to say, we have arrived at the destination, you can alight, not the taxi driver who will be able to be doing that. Many a times, mothers with infants are not properly catered for, and many a times, girls, let me indicate that young girls, if you are menstruating in our public facilities, in public transport, you will be unable to change your diaper. You will be unable to change your child's diaper also, because the facilities are not conducive for such an activity to can be able to happen. And people take this as one of those things, but I would say that this is seriously a violence against women. It is seriously a violence against any other person who is using the public transport. These colleagues, I must indicate that we are faced with a mammoth task in making sure that we turn around the public transport domain. It is very complex in nature, particularly the issues that we will be discussing today, that has brought a variety of participants who will be able, as we live here, map a way forward in line with the National Strategic Plan as outlined by Deputy Minister Mkhize. Some of these challenges, of course, are historical, but they emerge out of sheer decay of our human values. They emerge, and as we're looking at them today, they are saying to us, Ubuntu is no more one of the things that we are championing, and we need to rekindle that in order for us to can be able to say we are a people who cares. It is this very sense of collective humanity that has brought us through the committed struggle for freedoms, and we have defended these freedoms, and we need to continue protecting and promoting these freedoms into the future. Deputy Minister Mkhize has really spoken eloquently to what brings us together here today, and it is very clear that we've got an emergency in our hand, an emergency to make sure that we deal with the critical issues that makes our people very vulnerable to gender-based violence and femicide. The call to action have been sounded by many who feel disenfranchised by the very exclusionary, unsafe, and violent environment they must navigate on a daily basis. And public transport environment is such a setting which women, girls, and people with disability forever fears, because around these persons and the elderly people around them, they become very vulnerable as they must navigate their way out into the communities, their way into their homes. Colleagues, let me indicate that as South Africans, one of the most progressive, we've got several progressive legislations which deals with discrimination against women and girls, discrimination against the elderly, the infirm, and the disabled. Yet, when we look at GBV, which is escalating and it continued to become a concern to the nation, you would think that those legislations do not exist. For many South Africans, public transport is an essential part of an everyday life. In 2013, it was indicated that 3 in 4 people household relies on public transport. 51% of the people uses bus taxis, while 18% uses buses and 7.6% uses trains. And I must indicate that the scenario has since changed, that over 80% of the household relies on public transport, and over 60% of our population relies on the minibus taxi on a daily commuting. And now, what do we do when the situation is like this? 40% of the people that are working used public transport to go to work, while 3.7 million learners uses public transport to commute to schools. And let me remind my colleagues that for sure you have seen one of the videos that was trending where a 14-seater had accommodated 52 learners to transport to school. And just imagine if that public transport, a 14-seater, if it gets involved in an accident, what really happens? And I fear to think what will we be saying post that type of a thing. But this is some of the violence that our children are exposed to in the public transport. And imagine again a person who will be walking to work. As he walks to work, what really happens? You can be violated as being raped. You can anything can be able to happen to you as you will be traveling. But one other thing that, as we shall be discussing, we should take into cognizance is the fact that we need to look into the environmental designs in our townships, in our towns, as to are they conducive to can be able to accommodate people that will be walking to and from work, or walking to any other amenities around our communities. The services that are dispensed denigrates a lot of us women, girls, and encourages violence, including discriminatory practices. Sexual harassment and assault in public transport is an international and a national scourge of common and daily manifestation in that ranges from mild to very serious. The sinister whistling to a woman who passes on, the unsolicited touching, and even much aggressive touching and assault make up a few of the dangers that women are faced with on a daily basis. The totality of the consequences of these ills, if we visit them, go much further to tamper with the social, economic, psychological productivity of women. The mental burden of abuse and the fear experienced by women as they shuffle in the morning and in the afternoon from home to work to other amenities is littered with immense risks. It is certainly clear that gender-based violence has ramifications beyond physical and mental harm to persons, and it extends daily to the daily productivity, especially of those that are affected. Therefore, addressing gender-based violence in public transport is not only to improve the well-being and the safety of women, but equally to make sure that we contribute to the economic productivity of those that are affected. The following are the likely benefit of our action with regard to GBV and femicide, as stated by others. The increased use of public transport by women commuters will who feel safer is one of the things that has been realized, that 10% of these women, if we make sure that they are safer, they are protected, we will be able to get more passengers into the public transport. Reputational improvement between the users of transport and the transport operators is one key thing that we have to take into consideration. I am happy that Deputy Minister Mkhize has had a webinar with the transport operators, particularly the taxis, to try and guide them and show them the importance of respect to human rights, and in particular that of women and people living with disabilities. Confidence amongst the potential investors whose investment decisions are based on the safety reputation of the public transport providers is key and crucial. Increased economic growth through enabling women mobility and access to economic opportunities, access to education and employment, and improvement in health and safety, leading to lower absenteeism of particularly these vulnerable groups, goes a long way, because our economy is reliant on the things that we will be doing today. It is, however, not only in trains, buses, taxis, scholar transport where abuse is likely to occur, but across all modes of transport. We are certainly aware that many women have been arrested for drug trafficking, to only find that they have been forced into this type of business, as they themselves might have been trafficked or have been used as slaves or as mules. These are the things that public transport will be a mode of transport to all the trafficking that will be happening. It be human trafficking, it be drug trafficking. This is what we experience. And I need to hasten to indicate, Deputy Minister Mkhize, that on Wednesday, when I was in Musina, there were over 300 children who actually were crossing into South Africa illegally, so without a document. And you can just imagine what is going to be happening to those children once they arrive here in South Africa. We have developed programs, colleagues, with my team to partner with various departments. Department of Transport has partnered with the Department of Women, Youth, and People with Disabilities, the Deputy Ministry of Police, the Deputy Ministry of Home Affairs, and we will definitely be going into other departments to make sure that as we are working towards making public transport a safe environment for women and other people who gets violated, we're not only doing that in a silo kind of a mentality and action, but we're doing it with everybody who matters in this regard. The risk factors that have increased the likelihood of GBVF in transport sector include, but not limited to, these that I will be talking to, particularly on infrastructure. The unsafe, poorly public transport hubs, especially where passengers are forced to walk around stops and platforms, is a challenge. The unsupervised space without the physical presence of the transport workers, such as the guards or conductors, makes people very vulnerable to GBVF. And when you look at in other instances, you'll find that there are no even CCTV. The absence of the emergency buttons for the passengers and operators, that in the eventuality there is a challenge, you can be able to press that panic button, we are found wanting. Overcrowding, particularly in high risk of users being subjected to physical violence and sexual violence at the peak time, is one of the challenges that we have to look at, particularly in trains where you'll find that people are really squished towards each other. And it reminds me, Deputy Minister, of an incident that we saw with my minister when we were traveling by train from Khayelitsha to Cape Town Station. One young girl came with her jean torn at the back and was indicating that somebody was trying to rape her because they were squeezed in a particular platform. So these are the things that happen. People get violated in front of the public. And she was indicating that nobody cared as I was trying to kick and scream because this guy was really holding on to me. A lack of clear codes of conduct, for the workers and transport users and how they should behave are some things that are unacceptable. And we need to have a kind of a report where we can be able to report the incidents of GBV, particularly in the transport arena. Program Director, let me indicate that the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence makes it very clear that violence against women and girls cannot persist without us looking into how women are economically excluded. It goes also to propose mechanisms of how we should make sure that we empower women, given the structural dependence of women on men, which actually remains a cause for violence as is inflicted onto women. We need to accelerate economic transformation and the empowerment of women, and must remain a priority. And in the Department of Transport, our strategic plan and our annual performance plan have been reorganized in such a way that they should be able to cater for some of these things that we're talking to. And excited, the Minister of Transport have put forward the 5 priorities, which actually include as to how we should be able to deal with issues that impacts negatively onto women, people with disability, and the youth. We have committed as a department and its entity towards greater recruitment of women and people with disability and youth in our labor-intensive projects, and make sure that when vacancies are created in the department, we should consider these groups. This must be accompanied by a clearly monitoring strategy to empower women through procurement processes, to train women and to educate women as we move forward. And I need to say, important is we should be able to monitor these strategies because if we don't monitor, it can just be a talk shop that definitely coming into the future, we will not be able to say, we cannot be able to quantify. We will just have gone into a talk shop, but no valuable and tangible actions if we don't monitor these things. I need to indicate that public transport is also a space within which the rights of people with disabilities are highly infringed, as I have indicated earlier on. The Sustainable Development Goals are indicating, Goal 8 is indicating that there is a need for sustainable and inclusive growth, full of productive employment and decent work for all women, for men, and for people living with disabilities. And Goal 11 goes on further to say we need a safe and sustainable cities and human settlement, whereby there will be provision of access to safe and affordable transport, which actually must, we have to also improve the road safety, specifically by widening our public transport use with specific attention to the need of the vulnerable group, and in particular, people living with disabilities. It is important that we draw parallels from what President Mandela has said in his the trial in 1964, talking to universal access. President equated racial discrimination to the same discrimination experienced by people and persons with disabilities. The study that was conducted, and in her master's dissertation, Amanda Gibbert tends to state what was said by Nelson Mandela in 1964. And let me quote her. She says, in his speech, Nelson Mandela describes how the environment was the cause of both physical and psychological oppression, close quote. She goes on further to say the importance of the Rivonia trial in the history of the disability movement nationally is that it firmly places the social model of disability not as an import from the global north of Africa, but as an African export to the global north, close quote. It was again the president, the erstwhile president, the late President Mandela, who, when he reiterated universal rights to access, claimed that we need to make sure that the spirit of humanity must project itself throughout our commitment to firmly make sure that universal human equality must be observed. And our Constitution, through the Bill of Rights, indicates several of the rights that must be enjoyed by the groups that I have already indicated to. I have indicated earlier on that there are several legislations which are very progressive, and the promotion of equality and prevention of unfair discrimination is but one act that I can be able to say it binds us and it binds us to make sure that as we're dealing with issues of transformation, we must also look into issues of equality, particularly of the group that I have already spoken to. This act also ensures that steps are included, making sure that we remove the barriers of unequal participation. We make sure that there is promotion of enablers of participation, meeting all the relevant minimum standards and providing reasonable accommodation. South Africa is also a signatory to the Convention of the Rights of Persons Living with a Disability. We also, in the African Union Protocol, have got a charter of human and people's rights and on the rights of persons living with disabilities. Program Director, we are also aware that as a department, we have lagged behind in finding new and strengthening existing partnership with all the organizations representing the people with disabilities, with all the organizations that are championing women and children's rights. And this is one of the things, as I talk, we will be working with the Ministry of Women, Youth, and People with Disabilities so that we can be able to develop programs jointly so as to deal with the challenges as has been raised, and in particular to develop an action plan that will be coming from the strategic plan on as has been outlined by the Deputy Minister. It is important to mention that we cannot achieve the independence and self-sufficiency of women and people living with disabilities, youth, the elderly and the infirm, unless we clearly mainstream the safety and their empowerment. We must not only deal with the manifestation of GBV pandemic through the violence we see, but we must delve deeper into the economic and other social or cultural causes of this violence. it is also important that we help our communities, and in particular, we should work with transport operators across all modes that we can be able to deal effectively and have a sustainable gender-based violence-free public transport sector. We have committed to embark on a mass awareness campaign and education targeting our operators and our drivers, our marshals, but also to establish a formal training towards this purpose. Let me indicate that we have, together with the Minister of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities, developed a program where we will be visiting the train stations, the taxi station, the bus ranks, wherein we were able to start engaging and to look at what are the impediments that are there. I also hope that with this cooperation of everyone on this platform, we shall be able to work towards eradicating this second pandemic, as has been outlined by the President. Together, we can make this work. I thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Magadzi. I think there was some very insightful information and insights that you have shared with us this afternoon as you lead us now into the panel discussion. Before we enter the panel discussion, I'd just like to share a couple of house rules with all the participants. You are requested to keep your microphones on mute. You have an option to use the video option, but that is at your discretion. Also, I'm going to ask that we wait until the end of the panel conversation. Once all the panelists have spoken, only then will we be given an opportunity to ask questions, to give comments, and to seek clarity. We may do that by raising hands, using the raise hand icon on the screen, or alternatively, you can put your question or comment on the chat box and I will read it out. If you choose the option to raise your hand, then I will acknowledge you accordingly. Also, I implore that as we enter into that conversation, we all treat each other with respect and let us engage in a constructive and in a constructive manner, and let us keep an open mind. So as we enter into the panel discussions, we are being joined on today's panel by the Chief Director for Stakeholder and Outreach from the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability, that's Ms. Nseki Sisulu. We're also joined by the Policy Development and Advocacy Coordinator for Sonke Gender Justice, which is Ms. Zanele Mabaso, and also from People Opposing Women Abuse, we have Mr. Sidwal Sihwana, who will be joining as a panelist as well. And lastly, we have Dr. Linda Ncubenkomo from Love Life. I'd like to now invite Ms. Nseki Sisulu to address us. Ms. Sisulu, you have 3 minutes with which to talk to us. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. In which case, I think I will then leave the presentation. Good afternoon to the Deputy Minister of Transport, Mayor DIKELEDI MAGADZI, and the Deputy Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, Professor Hlengwe Mkhize. Perhaps I would just like to start with where the Deputy Minister of Transport had ended around how we as the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability, with the support of the Deputy Minister, have been able to engage the Department of Transport, the taxi industry in particular, on a number of issues. One being that of training the taxi operators, but another is that the taxi industry themselves have actually offered to ensure that their queue marshals are also trained in sign language, so that they they can also assist. But we had also brought on board persons with albinism so that they can actually engage with the taxi industry themselves. And one of the issues that the Albinism Society had raised was that can they please be accommodated around not waiting in the sun for so long because their skin is so sensitive. As much as they can use protection, they still need to be actually sheltered as they wait in the queues. The other request that they had was very practical in that they asked that they not be put close to the window when they have to sit. So, you know, when you're in the queue, you're asked to sit as you enter based on how you've been queuing. So some of the requests were very practical on the side of persons with disabilities. In terms of gender-based violence, I'm sure you'd have seen the videos the video that has gone viral from Nelspruit, and we have engaged with Mpumalanga, and I'm glad that part of the plans between the two deputy ministers actually is to go to Mpumalanga, amongst other issues, is to look at the issues of shelters, but also there was an issue of the two young women who had dressed as they chose to dress, and a man had decided to videotape them and follow them around in town, and then of course into the taxi rank. And as they were walking around, one was wearing short shorts and the other one was wearing a short dress. And as they were being followed around, a lot of people followed them, mostly men. And the one young woman's dress was lifted up as they were walking. So they were violated in every sense of the way, in every possible way. Their human rights were violated, their dignity was violated. There were young women who had agency in terms of them choosing to present themselves as they chose. And in terms of the work that we'd like to do with the Department of Transport and the taxi industry as a whole, is actually having the education and the awareness that we're raising to say women need to be safe in and around taxi ranks. And so we are really wanting to do this 365 days of the year. So that covers our youth and our persons with disability. But in terms of women empowerment, the issue that we were addressing with the taxi industry was around widows, that as taxi owners, which is still a predominantly male industry, is that as the men pass away, the women who choose to take over the business are finding it difficult, and that they do need to be assisted in ensuring that they can have an easier passage in taking over the business. So that women empowerment aspect is very useful, but also that women who just want to enter the industry, not having to wait for a man to pass away for them to take over the industry, that they should be able to do that. Deputy Minister, as we were preparing for 16 days of activism, we were in Port Alfred, and we had actually engaged the 43 Air School. And as we look forward to your engagement with your SOEs in partnership with the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, because one of the issues that the aviation space was looking at is the licensing of pilots and the renewal of pilot licenses. So we're really looking forward to working with yourselves as a department broadly, yes, on gender-based violence, but on the transport industry as a whole, and how it can work towards women's socioeconomic empowerment, and also the empowerment of young people, as well as those with disabilities. I'd like to, I think the Deputy Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, Professor Mkize, had done a very good job in terms of anchoring us on the National Strategic Plan, particularly the two pillars that we're focusing on during the 16 days, which is the social cohesion and the rebuilding of our social fabric of society. And I think between the webinar we will have with the SOEs and the Mpumalanga a visit that the deputy ministers are planning, we should be able to work on that. On the aviation side of issues and on the issue of the taxi ranks and the empowerment of women, we should be able to cover Pillar 5, which is a women's economic power within the Department of Transport and its sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Sisulu. Without any further waste of time, I think we can now move on to Ms. Zanele Mabaso from Sonke Gender Justice. Over to you, Ms. Mabaso.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Deputy Ministers for the very elaborative and comprehensive responses to GBV in public transport. As alluded, I just wanted to re-highlight that children and women represent the largest share of public transport users in the country, and yet they still do face quite a lot of barriers that limit their mobility. And the unfortunate part is that women don't have any other alternatives, and most of them depend on public transport. But what we do know is that transport has always functioned in ways that prioritize the needs of men over those of women and persons with disabilities. From access to public transport to its infrastructure, as the DM mentioned, and also the policies that appear to be gender blind. And gender is not considered in transport planning and projects. And this is what results in transport systems that do not meet the unique gender influenced demands, and then often leads to transport being unsafe. So what we need to do is we need to look at the infrastructure, we need to look at existing policies and implementation plans and make sure that they are passenger focused and gender centric, and they are cognizant of the needs of persons with disabilities, as well as pregnant women and women accompanying children. We also need to be, or rather move towards responding to this issue and recognize that transport systems need to be redesigned and improved to be responsive to the practical needs of vulnerable groups, such as the women, the children, the LGBTQI community, the persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth, as a matter of agency. And furthermore, gender needs to be mainstreamed into transport policies, projects, and implementation processes moving forward. So we recognize that sexual violence is a national pandemic, and gender-based violence and femicide is so far an uncontrolled, complete crisis in this country. So we were looking at the statistics reported by SAPS for the 2020 to 2019 period, and contact crimes and sexual offenses have increased drastically. They reported that about 352 people were raped while in transit in some form of transport. 76 people were raped while in train stations, and 43 people were raped at a taxi rank. Now we know that with these numbers, these are just reported cases, and many go unreported due to the manner in which the justice system responds to such cases. Also, approximately 7,940 people were raped in transport or rather public spaces, which includes parking areas and open fields, which are very close to public transport terrains and surroundings like bus stops. So what we need to now look at is what is the role of the departments to respond to these related and reported incidences that will allow us to lead ourselves to a desired future where such numbers are never again seen. So when women lose access to public spaces due to fear of violence, gender-based violence, and targeted crimes perpetrated against them, they not only lose their civic rights, but also access to vital economic, education opportunities, as well as the labor market, and access to affecting access to income generating activities and their overall constitutional rights. And that tells us that the responsible departments, therefore, need to do better. So perhaps just 3 things that we would like to perhaps see being done is that, number 1, the Department of Transport needs to establish a vacancy for technical expertise in sexual, gender-based violence and femicide within the Public Transport Directorate of the department. That will allow for effective mainstreaming of GBV programs and interventions in the department, and also ensure that SGBVF is clear priority of the department to address comprehensively. Number 2 is that Sonke Gender Justice commissioned a report highlighting gender-based violence in public transport in 2019. And in that report, we spoke to over 1,000 women and girls in Gauteng and the Western Cape province who tabled their lived experiences of gruesome sexual harassment, GBV, and femicide incidences. And in that report, we made a robust and comprehensive list of programmatic short-term recommendations, such as having CCTV cameras in taxi ranks, inside the taxis, doing awareness campaigns to improve safety in transit and also within public transport terrains. And we also made a very comprehensive systemic long-term recommendations, such as ensuring that there are labor law compliant systems in place to ensure that taxi drivers are vetted during their employment processes, and instilling effective reporting mechanisms that commuters can use to report SGPV and crime-related incidences as they happen. And also we enlisted some policy-specific interventions and interdepartmental coordination-related strategies that will assist the departments that are responsible for responding to this issue to get us to a place or that we desire to be in as far as eradicating GBVF in public transport is concerned. And very lastly, is that we have the NSP on GBV as highlighted by the DM of the National Transport. And that highlights the role of the Department of Transport to create safer public transport in the country by initiating need-based interventions, starting with a national-wide safety in public transport campaign that we want to see reach every vulnerable commuter using public transport, whether it is taxis, buses, or trains in the country. And with this, we look forward to the Department of Transport and the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities and other stakeholders working closely with SBOs and civil society organizations to realize the delivery of safety in public transport in South Africa. We also encourage the departments with us here today to work more closely with civil society organizations and social justice experts to address the issue more effectively and efficiently, and that both departments work towards fast-tracking the implementation of the NSP on GBV and also realizing the National Taxi Lekgotla 2020 declaration recommendations that we proposed on addressing sexual violence and harassment and gender-based violence and femicide in the public transport industry. So let me park it there, and then we will allow for questions later on.
Thank you, Ms. Mabaso, for those very interesting inputs you have just shared with us. The next 3 minutes goes to Mr. Sidwell Sehwana from People Opposing Women Abuse. Mr. Sehwana, the stage is yours. You may address us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Program Director. Yes, greeting to our two deputy ministers, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm here representing two organizations. I'm from an organization known as ADAPT, and yes, at the same time, I'm representing People Opposing Women Abuse. The two organizations collaborated under the program called Teens Alliance in Ending Sexual Violence in Schools. We then conducted a baseline, and some of the findings that came from the baseline spells out that learners are experiencing issues of sexual violence when using public transport. And some of the recommendations that came from the baseline clearly spells out that we need to engage and work very closely with the local taxi associations. We then forged our partnership with different local taxi associations. Maybe to name few, we can talk about the Tembisa one, the Tembisa Telta as in Tembisa Local Taxi Association, the Everton West Taxi Association. ADAPT has been working very closely with taxi association, two taxi associations that are based in Alexander Township, which is Amster and Atta. So these are some of the taxi associations that we've been working with. Our focus, it's mainly focusing on the prevention part, where we, are ensuring that we are running and facilitating workshops. We've been facilitating workshops we started with the executive of the local taxi association. We strongly believe that let's work with the executive so that we can empower them to be in a space where they are able to understand gender-based violence issues, specifically focusing on addressing issues of sexual violence. Just for them to be in a space where they are able to, know exactly what to do whenever these cases come into their offices. Organizations that are within their specific area that are actually offering services in response to address issues of gender-based violence. So we worked very closely with the executive of local taxi associations. We then train sub-rank leaders. We were, when we forged the partnership, we were informed that it's important for us to, try to start with also the sub-rank leaders, just to ensure that we also capacitate them around these particular issues. We then worked with taxi drivers, where we facilitated workshops around gender-based violence. And maybe I need to stress out that, while we were facilitating those, workshops, we realized, that this is one of the, department that require a number of engagement, because we can't run away from the fact that, it's one of the department that it's male dominant, where you find more men in this particular department, and the issues of patriarchy came out, a lot. Issues of entitlement came out a lot, and us working with them, we've realized, us having more sessions, for us to be able to do justice in unpacking these particular issues, because we've realized and we know very well that, gender-based violence, these are, issues that are socially constructed. Men are raised in society where they are bonding with these particular issues. And for them to be able to unlearn them, it requires a number of, engagement for them to be in a space where they are able to understand them differently and they are able to advocate around these particular issues. So, and then while we're busy training, we've reached a point where we also developed, messages in the form of bumper stickers, taxi drivers that played the role in terms of participating in these particular workshops, developed messages, and they were printed in the form of bumper stickers. And these are the messages that were plugged in different taxis. When you go to Everton, they are also using, private cars. They normally call them 4+1. And those are some of the 4+1 that were also, plugged. We launched and tried to ensure that we collaborate with, the likes of Theta FM. That is the local, radio station, where they were broadcasting live to ensure that we even empower members of society around the development and around, the engagement that took place, and sharing those messages. And the nicer part, maybe to reflect about these particular messages. These are the messages that, taxi drivers are pledging, are, telling that, they are not going to allow sexual violence taking place, at their respective territory. They would stand up to ensure that they address these particular issues. Some of the messages, they are addressing issues of, a miniskirt, that how women dress, they are not inviting us as men to come and violate them. So these are men who went through trainings. They are in a space where they are able to advocate around these particular issues in a form of bumper stickers. And at the same time, one of the things that we also, worked on is to develop policies. We've realized that, and working very closely with the, the DC of each and every, local taxi association, to ensure that, there's a policy that it's in line, policy that is going to help whenever there's a case of sexual violence coming into their office, in terms of how they are going to try to resolve, or address that particular topic, or that particular issue, so that they have a policy, they know referral procedures that are within their own territory, and what is their responsibility, as the association, to ensure that they address these particular issues that we are talking about. So, and I know Zanele from Sonke, worked very closely with them as well. They also have what we call Safe Ride radio drama that we played in different local radio stations to ensure that we raise awareness around issues of sexual violence, and specifically targeting, taxi drivers, targeting local taxi association, and getting to get a sense of what committers are actually, saying around issues of gender-based violence that are actually taking place in local taxi association. So these are some of the engagement, these are some of the workshops that we actually facilitated, and we keep on facilitating to ensure that we address issues of gender-based violence. But maybe to say, yes, Chair, maybe lastly, maybe to reflect and say, one of the things that it's critically important that we took from these engagements is that one session, two sessions, they will never do justice in addressing these particular issues. We need to have more sessions with these particular department to ensure that we are able to help them to unlearn these negative behaviors that they've bonded with. Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you, Mr. Sehwana. We will now move on to Dr. Linda Nkomo from Love Life. Over to you, Dr. Nkomo.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon, the DM of Transport, DIKELEDI MAGADZI, and the Deputy Minister for Women, Youth, and People with Disabilities, Professor Mkhize. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel discussion that's looking at the issue of gender-based violence. Now, as Love Life, we're an organization that deals with the youth. And in our dealings with the youth, the issues that are related to youth health, specifically their physical and their mental and social well-being, we realized that in implementing the programs that we've been implementing for our funders predominantly in the last 5 years, we've had a very, very strong focus on goals, mainly under the She Conquers campaign that was launched by the Department of Health. And there were like 5 objectives that needed to be met under that campaign. And as we were unpacking how we would go about engaging with young women and girls in that campaign, we realized that there was a gap. And that gap was the corresponding role of boys and young men that needed to be played. So in the campaign, what we wanted to aim as far as girls and young men were concerned was that we must reduce HIV, AIDS, new infections, reduce teenage pregnancies. They must stay at school. They must have safe environments, and they must be economically empowered. And realize that, well, who is making the girls pregnant in the absence of much older men and the relationships that they're in? We've got a big cohort of teenage fathers that are responsible for making girls pregnant. So what are we saying to those fathers? What are we saying around the safety of girls? Because they're not harming themselves, is the boys and the men that are in most instances the perpetrators of that violence. So we designed what we called the Boy Child Program that is focused on targeting boys and young men before they even become perpetrators of violence. And so it really speaks to what Professor Mkhize spoke to earlier on, expanding on the call of action to boys and young men, as well as creating awareness on harmful gender norms. And in the harmful, creating awareness and educating around harmful gender norms, it's really about addressing the issues that the previous panelist, Sidwell, was talking about, of entitlement, of toxic patriarchy, and of bringing back the values that the Deputy Minister of Transport spoke to, those values of Ubuntu. I mean, when the Deputy Minister shares a story of a young girl literally having her jeans ripped off at a train platform, and there's people looking around, it says a lot around where the values of protect, the values of respect, the values of love another person have gone. And that's what we're trying to recover with regard to the program that's targeting boys and young men. And we understand that although the bulk of the work that we do is looking at boys between the ages and girls between the ages of 10 and 24, they are not raised or operating in an island. And so when it comes predominantly to this program of boys and young men, we really looked at the ecological model within which these young people operate. So as much as we can engage with the individual and we can empower him and we can do what we believe is necessary to start turning the tide that they're in. But he belongs to a family, and we have to engage with that family. And it belongs to a community, and we must engage with that community. And it belongs to a greater society. So part of the work of what we are doing, and at this point, we're doing it really at a below the radar level, because our programs are funded and there's very little funding targeting boys and young men. But it's really to make sure that we can engage with them. Pre-COVID, it would have been a lot of face-to-face interactions in our youth centers, at sports hubs, at schools. And post-COVID, there's been a lot of interaction with them on social media platforms. But we're also using community radio stations in order to have a bigger reach of being able to engage with the families and the communities that they are growing up and being raised in. And as we were defining what we wanted to do with boys and young men around the issues of gender-based violence, we actually realized that the problem we face is bigger than just gender-based violence. We face a problem of violence as a whole in the country. So if you look at the national statistics that the Minister of Police releases every year, there's a lot of men killing men, there's a lot of boys killing men. And we need to start looking at how we can address this holistically. And now, while I know that this particular panel is really talking around gender-based violence, we really need to start looking at an expansion of this call to action to be a call that says, why are we so violent? Why are we such a violent society? Now, if I can just give you an example of what my lived experience specifically with men in the public transport sector. Our offices are about 500 meters from a taxi rank behind the Cecil building in Sandton. And so often I walk from the office to Sandton City because it's just easier to walk than to drive there. And I can tell you 9 times out of 10, I'm feeling nervous when I'm walking through this taxi rank, not because necessarily they're whistling at me, I've learned to shut down that noise, but because these men are fighting each other. There's a heated argument going on. Somebody has grabbed a stone or a brick, and the others are cheering them on. It's like there's a football match going on, and yet there's a really dangerous situation that's going on. So we really need to be looking at a broader conversation that says, how do we deal with the issue of violence, of men against men violence, of them killing themselves, of boys being perpetrators of murder? How do we kill this tree at the root so that we don't have to start worrying about how safe are women, how safe are children when they're going out into the public transport space, when they're going out to schools, when they're going out to work? Because at the root of the problem, where we see a symptom or a fruit of femicide and gender-based violence and infanticide, is really a problem that is speaking to violence as a whole. So some of the initiatives that we are doing, we have decided as an organization that during these 21 days of activism for no violence against men and children, in all the provinces where we've got presence, we will try to be addressing as much as 300 boys to get them to understand the issue of violence and the issues of what are their responsibilities for us to realize the rights of women and children. And not only to sign pledges, but to make sure that we then have got ongoing interventions that can enable them to come out at the other side of the intervention as a person who understands that violence is really the problem that we need them to be part of stemming and eventually stopping. And then my closing words.
Time, Dr. Nkomo, so if you can please wrap up so that we allow questions.
So my closing words would be to the Deputy Minister of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities, that while the UN has got a 16 days of activism of no violence against women and children, could we as a country not look at 365 days of no violence?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nkomo. bringing in a different perspective there in terms of your organization targeting boys and young men to make sure that some of these issues are addressed at foundational level. Deputy Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, we are now entering the question and answer session. Like I had indicated earlier, you may ask your question or post your comment on the chat box or raise your hand. And should you raise your hand, I will acknowledge you, and then we will allow the relevant panel member or either of the deputy ministers to respond to those questions. And if I may ask, when you do ask your question, if you can put on your video so that we can see your face, and just briefly introduce yourself. The floor is open for questions and comments.
Chair, may I come in? Apologies, my video is not working, but I would like to rather post a comment at this point. This is Zanele from Sonke.
Yes, carry on, Zanele.
All right. So it is just to say that with the 2019 report that we commissioned, we would like to encourage the Department of Transport as well as the Department of Women and Youth and Persons with Disabilities to refer once again to the report, particularly its recommendations, both programmatic and systemic recommendations that really detail what key interventions and strategies can be implemented to potentially eradicate gender-based violence and sexual harassment in public transport, and that it should be a first point of departure in really understanding the shocking and debilitated state of traveling while women in South Africa. We would also like to just encourage the Department of Transport to visit the National Strategic Plan and begin implementing the interventions prescribed for the department, and also realizing what activities can be implemented in order for the department and other key stakeholders to be able to effectively implement the National Taxi Lekgotla declaration. And I guess perhaps last but not least is that on the tail end of Transport Month last month, we had the National Taxi Lekgotla. And in less than 5 days ago, there was a gruesome shooting at the Cape Town Station Deck taxi rank that left about 6 men and a woman wounded. And such violence and reckless taxi wars affect innocent passengers and also women and children who witness these gruesome and unacceptable scenes. And it is very unfortunate that this happened about 5 days ago after we had the Lekgotla, where all of these issues were tabled, and there was commitment from various stakeholders and taxi associations to say, we will work together to work towards eradicating taxi violence in the sector. And therefore, I would like to encourage the Department of Transport and Department of Women and Youth and Persons with Disabilities to recognize that they have a very big role to play in bringing safe transport for all in this country. And that by ensuring that we work towards fast-tracking the implementation of the NSP and the declaration, we will be able to realize public transport that is safe, efficient, reliable, affordable, accessible, and also caters to the unique needs of vulnerable groups such as persons with disabilities, the LGBTQI community, women, children, and migrants as well. That is my comment for now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mabaso. I am confident that with support and partnership from advocacy groups such as yours, both deputy ministers can be supported in making sure that some of the work that you do and the research findings and recommendations that you come up with are catered into in policy formulation and in the implementation of the programs that have been put in place. Mr. Sulu, I do note your hand, but before we come to you, there is a comment from Bosa Ramanzi, which is a very positive feedback. Bosa says, I'm very impressed with the strides being made by the taxi industry to alleviate GBV in that space, and also agrees that 1 or 2 sessions are not enough, but the little bit that has been done is a way to start, and hopes that there will be more engagements about further interventions going forward. Thank you for that comment, Busa. Mr. Sulu, you may ask your question.
Thank you very much. I think I really wanted to make more of a comment. I think I took my 3 minutes very literally. But in terms of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence around Pillar 2, where we are now, it does call on a 365-day campaign on gender-based violence and femicide, which had action back in 2006 in that was then put in action in 2000 and adopted in 2007. With the district development model and with the 6th administration and a more integrated approach, there has been greater commitment, and with the development of the National Strategic Plan and adoption thereof, of a more inclusive and a more integrated approach to how government is doing its work. In 2019, government approved a behavior change campaign that is to be led by Government Communication Information System, GCIS, which actually is aligned to Pillar 2 of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, which calls for a 365 days of no violence against women and children, which is the 365-day campaign that I believe Linda Ncube is then requesting. To say to you that it is underway, it is work that is actually currently happening. The important part is the integration, is actually, it will be tomorrow, that Pillar 2 of the conveners of Pillar 2 of the National Strategic Plan will be convened to make sure that happens. So actually, if I just quickly do this, I'm not sure if is that presentation showing? Oh, let me share quickly. Is that showing?
Yes.
All right. So if you see that this 365-day campaign, if I just go to the first slide. So this is from 2009, which was approved by a cabinet, right? And then it was subsequently followed by the National Strategic Plan, which of course gives effect to this campaign, which is to be led by GCIS. So there's a greater integration, and this you will find greater expression within the district development model. So I think there is some positive, and I want to thank the comments that has come that actually sees that there is a more implementation rather than talking about and developing more frameworks towards that. And remember that as a country, we did not have any document that rallied all of us around a common framework that people were buying into. Even the National Strategic Plan, like the Constitution, not everybody is sold on it, but at the same time, we've got to move forward with the majority because we are in crisis mode. And now with the dual pandemic of COVID-19 and gender-based violence, we can't help but make sure that we are moving with the majority. We do want to see a safer South Africa on that. But the important part about the National Strategic Plan is that it recognizes that gender-based violence is a societal issue, that every single one of us in every single sector has to play a role. Deputy Minister of Transport, MAGADZI, it's important also for us as the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability to also bring to your attention that in working with the transport, with the taxi industries, that we actually realized that as we wanted to brand the taxis, that they were actually not registered with the central database system of the National Treasury. So we needed to actually assist them, work with the Department of Small Business so that they can actually be registered officially, because actually you can't go on 3 quotes to register, to brand taxis, because they are only taxis. So, but it does, the PFMA does make provision for you to have a sole service provider. So it's those kinds of things within our industry. When you look at issues of empowerment, and you can't say the taxis are small, but a single taxi person is a small owner because they're the only person. So there are those glitches that as you work with the industry, you find that as much as they are making strides, they do still need some support to actually be able to work with government in a formalized way that allows us to comply with the regulations and allows them to be able to be service providers of government as well. So I'm really trying to say that as much as we are working with the various sectors within society, we still need to help, especially SMMEs and particularly those who be women, as we look at the empowerment aspect of it. If they are going to be able to stand on their own, to be financially independent, as one of the tools that allow women to come out of relationships that may, that are abusive, this is but one aspect, which is financial independence that could allow them to get there. So I was trying to address a couple of issues in my response on the 365 issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Sulu, for those added comments. I see that earlier on, Usis Nomusa Mayego started typing a comment. Sis Nomusa, is there a comment or question that you wanted to ask earlier? Yes, go ahead, Sis Nomusa. You are on mute.
Mute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yes, I started to type in some of the comments that I wanted to make, in addition to the contributions that were made by all of the speakers, from the 2 deputy ministers, from Sonke, the gender justice, from Ms. Sisulu, and from the others. My own contribution would be, there are some nuances that are not particularly taken as gender violence in the department itself. For an example, you will find that in order to obtain a job, a manager, male usually, would require a person who's unemployed, looking for a job, to pay money that they don't have. The trauma that comes with that is immense, and yet it's not even identified as some form of violence within the value chain of violent behavior towards women. Some of the men would demand sexual favors from women when job opportunities come up. And this goes along the value chain, whether you are applying for training, even if you are employed, or for a promotion. So those things must then be I don't know how we can sort them out so that they do not become the norm as they have been because people do not regularly report them. But in order to support Deputy Minister DIKELEDI, Deputy Minister Professor Mkhize, who spoke very eloquently about the empowerment of women in transport, particularly in public transport, and also Sonke, who Ms. Zanele spoke about the infrastructure that is necessary to ensure the safety of women in public spaces, particularly public spaces that are for public transport users and operators. Taxi ranks, for an example, they must be well lit and they must be camera, not only physical infrastructure, but the technologies that are used in other countries to ensure that the safety of women is assured. That if a person is raped, for an example, or is assaulted by any violator, a taxi rank, the law enforcement officials, if there are CCTV cameras, can identify those violators very, very quickly and make sure that they are brought to book. Also in taxis, there must be some of those CCTV cameras, and places must be well lit throughout the day, and they must be, they are not, there's not a place for an example, where a person who cannot see is told to say, there's a technology that we use in the lifts nowadays that this is floor 1, 2, 3. That technology can also be used for the taxi ranks, for the buses, for trains, to say this is where you are, this is where you get off, this is where, so that you can then be able to have that safety and the confidence of knowing that you are where you are supposed to be. And also, I heard that Abu Zanele and others are training taxi drivers and queue marshals to also have sign language so that people abangezwa nabangakwazi ukukhuluma bawazi ukuthi banakekelwe in those spaces. I have a lot more, but I also wanted to say, for particularly manufacturers of vehicles, we would think we should consider regulation, at least minimum requirements for a person who is buying a vehicle for public transport operations. They must have those cameras, things that they must have those cameras. They must have spaces for people for wheelchairs. They must have accommodation. They must have accommodation for people with wheelchairs. They must have technology that assists people who are unable to see but can hear. All of those things must be regulated so that they become part of the minimum standards as required for assisting government to ensure that all of our people are taken care of, regardless of the capacity that they have, whether you are differently abled, you can't see but you can hear, whether you can see but you can't hear, whether you need a wheelchair, whether you need sign language. It mustn't only be guidelines as it usually is. I think that it should be regulated. It must be a legal requirement to have that if you are going to be a taxi or a public transport operator and owner. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Sis Nomusa. Deputy Minister Magadzi, if you allow me, I think for prudency, as the host, I would prefer that you have the last word. So according to the program, you are meant to be giving us closing remarks, but I humbly request that we wrap up the summary of discussions, then we can allow you to do the closing remarks, ma'am, if that is okay with you.
Thank you, Rifense. I think it's fine with me.
Okay, thank you. So just in terms of a summary of points that came through for discussion, and I must upfront apologize profusely to Deputy Minister Professor Mkhize, as I did not catch your opening remarks. However, I'm sure colleagues can later share a summary from there. But just to glean over what Deputy Minister Magadzi shared with us, that we must be open, frank, and constructive for us to find a way forward for the vulnerable groups who are at the receiving end of gender-based violence. That public transport infrastructure has to be designed in a way that accommodates the vulnerable groups, especially persons with disability. And I think Sis Zanele Mabaso also raised that issue, that as South Africans, we have progressive legislation which deals with discrimination against vulnerable groups. However, the scourge of GBV does not reflect the existence of those various legislations. We need to look into environmental and spatial design of our residential areas, especially townships, to ensure it makes provision for ease of access to public transport facilities. GBV also affects the economic productivity of victims. And Deputy Minister, I think this is one element that hasn't been paid a lot of attention. And it speaks to then how we economically empower the vulnerable groups, especially women, so that they are given the freedom to be able to come out of abusive relationships and arrangements at any given time. And lastly, Deputy Minister, you indicated that the increased use of public transport by female commuters is dependent on the provision of safe public transport facilities. Then we moved on to, you moved on to indicate the lack of security personnel and systems such as CCTV, which I think Sis Nomusa also indicated now, which exposes commuters. Overcrowding at peak time, especially in trains. The example you shared about the young lady in Cape Town is not unique. It is a lived experience, and it goes back ages in terms of just what women are subjected to, especially in rail commuter transport when there's overcrowding. The fact that the National Strategic Plan on GBV states that there has to be economic inclusivity of women to reduce GBV. You shared with us the 5 priorities put forward by the Minister of Transport on how to cater for vulnerable groups. And lastly, you indicated a need for monitoring of strategies to ensure valuable and tangible actions. And that, Deputy Minister, is extremely important, because that which is not measured will never be done. So if there's adequate monitoring, measuring, and evaluation of interventions, that will ensure that that is put to paper is put to practice as well. Then Mr. Sulu spoke to what the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities is doing insofar as the protection of vulnerable groups is concerned within the public transport sector. She indicated that the taxi industry has offered to train queue marshals in sign language to accommodate persons with disabilities, and that the requests have been made for accommodation of persons with disabilities, that those requests are being considered in partnership with the taxi industry, and also that education and awareness on safety of women at taxi ranks is critical and needs to be undertaken as a matter of urgency. And I'm quite impressed, Mr. Sulu and Deputy Minister Professor Mkhize, with the urgency with which you are treating incidents like that one that went viral from Mpumalanga. It is really encouraging to see leadership at your level and making sure that these issues are addressed. But I would also request that they are not only addressed, but are seen by the public to being addressed. And I think that will give a lot of women who are vulnerable a lot of confidence that something is being done. Ms. Mabaso from Sonke Gender Justice indicated the high dependency of women on public transport, and that the existence of police that appear to be gender blind. And I think that's a very critical point to make, because for justice to be served, you need a police service that is not tone deaf, a police service that understands and can empathize with victims of gender-based violence. That there has to be gender-centric policies that are responsive to practical needs of vulnerable groups, and that a high number of repeated rape cases in public, within public transport have been reported, and that needs attention. And also a question you posed to the Deputy Minister of Transport is, how does the Department of Transport respond to these incidents of rape? And you shared with us 3 things that as Sonke Gender Justice you are proposing should be attended to. That a vacancy for a technical expert within public transport branch of the department needs to be considered. That you as an advocacy group, you ran research, a report of which was published in 2019 in Gauteng and Western Cape, with short-term recommendations for systemic interventions, including vetting of taxi drivers, and that lastly, there's a needs-based interventions which are being considered for all vulnerable commuters, so that they are able to enjoy the safe use of public transport in the country. Then Mr. Sihwana, representing people opposing women abuse and ADAPT, indicated the collaboration with the taxi industry on research revealing that learners are being sexually abused while using public transport, the close collaboration with taxi associations across Gauteng province, which targets taxi owners and taxi drivers alike, and the workshops on gender-based violence that have been facilitated with taxi drivers, and a commitment from taxi drivers to protect vulnerable groups and advocate for the end of gender-based violence. And I think that's a very important commitment, because for us to be able to address these issues, they need to be attended to at grassroots level. And that point, Mr. Sehwana, was closely linked to what Dr. Ncube Nkomo from Love Life indicated, the fact that there is a gap that exists between the roles of young girls and young men in youth health, and that Love Life has designed a boy-child program that targets boys and young men on their role in harmful gender norms. She indicated the need to bring back and entrench the values of Ubuntu, as indicated by Deputy Minister Magadzi, and also a need to engage with boys and young men through various channels to ensure maximum reach, and that includes both traditional media, it includes social media, and also it includes face-to-face interaction. And that, Deputy Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of this roundtable discussion. I am pained because it has been a very productive and fruitful conversation. I wish more time had been allocated, but I am sure Deputy Ministers, we will find time in the near future to reconvene and look at what progress has been made based on the conversations that have been held today. With that, I would like now to re-invite Deputy Minister Magadzi to give us closing remarks for this webinar. Deputy Minister, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rifense. Deputy Minister Professor Mkhize, the panelist, Nziki Sisulu, Zanele Mabasa, Sidwell Sehwana, and Dr. Ncube Nkomo. Thank you so much for the insightful discussions and the presentations that you have made. And I would outright say that the President demands of us to not work in silos, and therefore our engagement with the Ministry of Youth, of Women, Youth and People with Disability is but an indication that a northern Sotho saying which says, united we will be able to conquer, and united we will be able to achieve. I would like to indicate that most of the issues that have been raised, which actually says to us as the Department of Transport, wake up and smell the roses, are the things that definitely I have been given the responsibility by the minister to deal with issues of transformation, to deal with issues of gender. I'm going to be taking them up and engaging the department, particularly Deputy Minister and Mercy Sulu, on stakeholder engagement. We definitely will come back to you to say, this is an action plan that we'd like to implement. Guide us. Are we doing the right things? Could this be the route that we should follow? But also to engage with other role players. It's very important that we come closer to gender justice and to power. It's very important that we're able to engage with a lot of you, because you've got massive information that we can be able to use to make sure that we turn around the challenges that are there in this male-dominated industry. But let's say the Department of Transport in itself is male-dominated, and how do we make sure that we talk to road construction and we can be able to see women there, not as women who will be making tea for the bosses there in the industry, but women who in their own rights are in construction industry. How do you, Nziki has spoken eloquently to the aviation industry. We need to go in there and say, what are the programs that we should be able to implement? And here I'm talking to the SOEs that we find in the Department of Transport. Let's not look only in the public transport arena, but there are so many other state-owned entities in the Department of Transport that we should start looking at. I can tell you that I was in Rail Safety Regulator on Friday, and one of the things that I was asking is, how do you involve women? They say, no, the only time we involve women is when they cater. They're doing catering. Hell, catering is not meant for women only. They should be able to look into how to engage women in terms of dealing with the critical issues of safety in the railway sector. And what are the critical things that they can be able to look at, not talking that the only time we engage with SMME is when we request women to come and cater for the events and the functions in that particular space. But let me thank my colleague, Deputy Minister, Professor Mkhize, and say you have really encouraged me, and you have put a vavavoom in the Department of Transport through me to make sure that we are able to look at everything that we're doing, not with rose-colored glasses, but look at, face them with the real eyes of a real human being who understand the issues and who is geared to say, where do we go from here? How do we take the issues of women forward? Because it's in our hands. It's in our hands to turn the tide. It's in our hands to make sure that we deal with the issues that are so pertinent. You know, yesterday listening to the children that have been slaughtered by the, I'm saying slaughtering deliberately so, because if you kill your children, if you shoot at your children, burn the house, take an axe and chop them like you're chopping wood. What is that really? How do we deal with that type of a situation? Because people have turned themselves to be God, that they can be able to take people's life. When you rape your children, and it is okay in the society that you have raped your children, and it's fine. We can't eat our very own like that, but this is what is happening.
And it makes women to be so frightened to walk the streets. It makes women to be so frightened to be, even when they are in their houses, they still are frightened of the eventualities that can be able to happen in our very own homes. And I would really and heartily thank Deputy Minister, and thank all the panelists, and thank everybody who has been on the platform sharing noble ideas with us. And believe you me, Mercy Sulu, let me say to you, come 6 months, come and evaluate, come and check. For me, I take it that this was a platform was not just a platform for the sake of us talking, but it should be a platform where we can be able to engage and say, we have started, these are the things that we can be able to, let's look and evaluate and see if we're doing the right things. Shinas, as a program director, thank you so much, Rifente, and those who organize this program, Panda Studios. Thank you so much, because we are, because you have made us to be. Have a lovely Sunday afternoon further, and believing that the 16 days of no violence, as outlined by the United Nations, is not the 16 days. We're highlighting some of the issues during this period, but we know that this is 365 days, 24/7 of us making sure that we protect the vulnerable amongst ourselves. Thank you very much, Mary Fenton.
Thank you for those humbling words, Deputy Minister. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this webinar, and I guess I speak on behalf of all of us when I say to both Deputy Ministers that we look forward to moving ahead and to future interactions, especially where progress has been made with regards to some of the programs that are already in place. Thank you, everybody, and have yourself a wonderful Sunday afternoon. And do remain active, not only within the 16 days of activism, but 365 days around the clock. And do not tire with the great work that you are doing. Thank you all.